Okay, everyone, welcome. This is Stanford Transportation's webinar, Bike Gears Made Easy. I want to welcome all of you here today. Thanks for joining us. We've been doing a series of 2 webinars per month since we've been under shelter in place due to COVID, and we've had amazing results and participation. So we thank you for joining us today and being a part of this virtual new way of learning all about bikes, and we hope that you're continuing to ride despite the heat. I think everyone knows, my name is Ariadne Scott. I'm the Assistant Director of Active Mobility at Stanford and manage the bicycle program. I think everyone knows we're a platinum bike-friendly university by the League of American Bicyclists. I've been car-free for over 20 years. I serve as a board member for People for Bikes Foundation, and obviously I love to ride just like you do too. I'm going to turn this over to Robert. So we want to thank you for joining us. We have a history of spinning our wheels on the Stanford campus since 1891. I don't know if many of you have seen this archived photo, but this is real. These are high wheelers on the steps of Encina Hall. We love this photo because it shows the connection to bikes that goes back from the beginning of time. So we want to perpetuate that commitment to riding bikes on campus and do everything we can to support and encourage people to opt to ride their bikes versus drive their car. So I'm going to turn this over to Robert Alverson with Bikes Make Life Better, who's going to lead the webinar, and I'll be behind the scenes managing your Q&A questions and any follow-up you may have. So Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you, and welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Ariadne. So as mentioned, I'm Robert Alverson. I work with Bikes Make Life Better. We're a locally based bicycle consulting firm, and my title is Ops Manager, but really I just handle everything involving the intersection of spreadsheets and reality. So I was a bike mechanic for many years, working in Bay Area bike shops. I've also worked in bike manufacturing and spent some time operating a bike share with Bikes Make Life Better. My knees hurt, so I'm all about gearing. I don't ride a fixed gear, and took it a little too far once and built a 63 speed bike. So it had external gears, internal gears, and it's way more than you ever need, but it was a fun build. So today we're going to be talking about shifting, and so why you would want to shift and how you would do it. So first we'll talk about changing gears, shifting, why, when, and how. A little bit about bike anatomy, maintaining your gear system on your bike, and then we'll open up for Q&A. My goal is to have a fair amount of time for the Q&A at the end, and we'll be pausing throughout after each section so that you can pose your questions. Feel free to pop them into the Q&A at any time, however. So originally bikes didn't have gears. Your gearing, such as it was dictated by the size of your front wheel. And you could have a front wheel as long as your inseam, and that dictated your top speed. So if you wanted to go fast down a hill or in a race, being taller helped you because you could fit a larger front wheel. And as we all recall from physics and maybe riding a single speed or a big wheel when we were a kid, the bigger your wheel, the farther you go per pedal stroke. And so the goal with shifting is to match your gear to your pedaling input. So low gears are easier, like gear 1 in your car would be a low gear. You cover less distance per pedal stroke. High gears are harder, so you cover more distance per pedal stroke. And so when you're going up a hill, or starting out, you would want a low gear. And when you're coming down the backside of that hill, you would want a high gear. And we do this because it's more comfortable. Human beings are mostly designed for walking and running. So we don't have actually a wide range of speeds that you can efficiently move your legs at. Humans want to be going between 60 to 120 steps per minute. and 80 is an efficient pedaling cadence for most people, which brings us to more efficient. If you've been at the gym and used a stair step machine, you know that pressing and lifting your entire body weight each step is a pretty good workout. That's what we're trying to avoid on the bike. So we want to keep our cadence high so that we're not having to use our entire body weight to move the bike forwards. So the most common question I think we've gotten throughout this series has been, what's the right gear? Closely followed by, how hard should I be pedaling? And it's quite hard to quantify how hard you should be pedaling or what the right gear is, because your bike may have 3 gears or 63, and your version of what it is to be hard pedaling versus soft pedaling is different than mine. But both questions really have the same answer: cadence. So like I was saying earlier, we're wanting to keep our pedal strokes at a high enough speed so that we're not having to lift ourselves on each stroke to move that bike forwards. And if you're maintaining about an 80 RPM cadence, then you're definitely not going to be slogging super hard on the bike. You're going to be a lot lighter on the pedals, and it's going to feel better and be more efficient. If you're into running or other aerobic sports, there's websites that match songs to your steps or beat per minute. So I would recommend Googling those if you're having a hard time imagining what about 80 RPM cadence would be. It's a little bit, if you're riding a bike, it's probably just a little bit faster than you're riding it now. Most people default when they're getting into cycling to about a 50 to 60 RPM cadence, which is a little bit low and can make cycling a little bit harder than it really does need to be. All right, so that's why you would want to shift. But when do you need to shift? So my favorite example, of course, is hills. Not all of us are going up examples as steep as this. This is the, I believe it's the steepest hill in the United States. It's in Pittsburgh. And every year there's a race to see who can get up this hill the fastest. And it really is this steep. It's no joke. But even if you're not going up a hill this steep, if you're going up over an overpass, you might want to shift down into a lower gear to make it easier to carry your speed over that overpass and keep your cadence high. Likewise, if you're coming down the other side of the hill and you're getting a little bit more speed, you can carry that speed and add to it by shifting into a higher gear. So as you approach a hill, overpass, or epic climb, anticipate shifting to an easier gear. It's easier to shift when you're not putting a lot of power into the pedals. So if you find yourself coming up to a hill and that slow incline is building and building and you're slowing down, it's a good sign that it's time to shift. As you're coming down the backside and you're pedaling and the pedaling's getting lighter and lighter and lighter, and you're maybe spinning at a really high cadence and it doesn't feel like you're putting any weight on the pedals at all, shift into a harder gear. It'll A, bring your cadence down, and B, actually get you putting some power into the bike. Even if you're not trying to accelerate while you're going down the back of that hill, keep shifting into that harder gear, because as you're going, it's going to keep you matched to the speed of the bike. So when you get to the bottom and you're ready to start pedaling on that flat, you're not trying to pick up a whole bunch of gears all at once. It'll just make your ride a tiny bit smoother. The other time to shift is when you're preparing to stop. So this photo is from the League of American Cyclists, and they advise using a pedal power position. That's when you come to a stop, you want to stop with one of your crank arms and your pedal up at a 45. Horizontal's okay too. You can see this person's got a little bit flatter. This person has a pretty good position here. And this gives you a good stance to start pedaling, pushing down out of that stop. So it lets you use your gears to accelerate the bike rather than having to push with your foot. But for this to work, you do need to be in the right gear to leave that stop. If you're in a very hard gear, you're just going to push on that pedal and you're just going to stand up on the bike and the bike's going to move very slowly. If you're in too easy of a gear, you're going to stand up on that pedal, push down, and the bike's going to move forward easily, but you're not going to get a whole lot of speed on it. So if you're keeping a cadence, as you're slowing down into that stop, it'll help you find that gear for starting again. Generally, you don't want to be in your very easiest gear. Likewise, you don't want to be in your very hardest gear. The exceptions would be, of course, if you were starting going on a downhill, you could be in a much harder gear. Or if you were starting on an uphill, right? As you came to that stop, you'd want to shift into an easier and easier and easier gear. And that's something that you'll find as you're riding around. You'll sort of start finding those gears that are easier or harder for you to start or stop in. All right. So as when to shift. So remember, keep your cadence up. Use a catchy song. Anticipate terrain and downshift. And anticipate stops and also downshift. Again, you're going to want to set up that gear before you stop. And perfect question from an anonymous attendee. Is it okay to shift gears when you're standing still? No. So that's why you want to get into that starting gear before you stop. If you're shifting when you're stopped on derailleur bikes, so bikes with a chain, the derailleur can't move because it's locked through the chain to the cassette, and it has to be, the chain has to be moving for that shifter to move and be able to slide the chain over to the next gear. So I'm going to give you all a second to put any questions you have into the Q&A, and we'll answer them before moving on to the next section, which will be bike anatomy. All right.
I have a quick bit of trivia. That hill in Pittsburgh is called Canton Avenue, and the grade is 37%. It's the steepest officially recorded public street in the United States. That's steep.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we have a Q&A. I don't listen to headphones. Pros and cons of having a gadget to tell me what cadence I'm at. Currently, I just try to keep it feelable, easy, and less actively climbing. I think that's actually a great method. If you're keeping it a little easy, it's going to keep you in the right range for your cadence. And if you do find that you're having problems identifying that cadence, you can either put your phone on speaker and play that song, or you can get, I think what you're referring to is a cycle computer that would bolt onto your bike, and it can tell you what cadence you're at. Hitting exactly 80 is by no means a requirement, but that's just a target range. So if you're 85, 70, 90, as long as you're feeling that it's a little easy, then you're probably in about the right range. And we have another question. What's a good way to increase your RPM? So if you want to increase your RPM, just shift down to easier gear and stay there, and that'll force you to ride at a higher cadence. Of course, if you go too far and it feels like you're not doing anything at all and you're not going at the speed you want to, then go back to a harder gear. But definitely if you're riding around, and this would go to the previous question as well, and you find that it's a little too hard, drop into that easier gear, or if your cadence is a little too low, drop one gear easier, and it's going to bring up your RPM.
Robert, I have to ask you, what's your favorite song for cadence?
Staying Alive by the Bee Gees.
That's a good one.
It's got a good groove to it. I won't try singing it, spare you all that. All right, I'm going to keep rolling forwards, and feel free to keep those Q&As coming. All right, so bike anatomy. This is your friend, the bike. We're probably familiar with most of the basic elements here. Wheels, frame. I've been referring to the cranks, pedals, and then your shifting system, right, on this bike would be derailleurs, and power is transmitted in some way, depending on the bike, either chain or belt, from the cranks to the back wheel by the chain in your shifting system. When I'm referring to these diagrams, forwards is always the front of the bike, and then the left side of the bike would be the side without the chain and gears on it, and then the right side is the side of the drivetrain, so chain, gears, all that fun stuff. So if I'm saying right and left, I'm usually trying to refer to the right-hand side of the bike itself. All right, so here we are looking at a derailleur system. So what makes this a derailleur system is that it has mechanisms that derail the chain onto and off of different gears. So this would be your front derailleur. Right now we're in the big chain ring. So this outer cog is your chain ring, as well as this inner cog. So this would be the big chain ring, small chain ring. And so when you use your front derailleur, if you're shifting to an easier gear in your front derailleur, it's going to move from a larger cog to a smaller chain ring, larger chain ring to smaller chain ring. And the same thing happens with the rear derailleur. When you shift in the back, it's going to move the chain between the cogs on your cassette. So you're going to go from, if you're in a hard gear, which would be one of these smaller cogs, and want to go to an easier gear, the rear derailleur would move your chain inwards. And chains do require maintenance, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. All right, this would be an internally geared hub. You may notice it does not have quite as much complication going on around the rear of the bike here, or around the chain ring up here. It's because all the shifting for this bike happens inside of the rear hub. So the advantage of this is that it keeps everything safe and protected from the elements. Usually these hubs are full of oil and keeps everything nice and clean and prevents rust. This particular bike is using a belt, which again eliminates one more metal part from the system and reduces wear on the drivetrain, and also reduces maintenance. Chains you would want to keep lubricated. Belts you don't need to keep lubricated, you just replace them when they wear out. They have very long design service life. But other than that, the elements are still the same, right? You have a crank, you have a chain ring, you would have a shifter that would actuate this rear hub to change your gears. The one other upside of having an internally geared hub is that you can, in most cases, shift an internally geared hub while you're stopped. So if you are finding that you don't like doing maintenance on your bike and do want to shift it when you're stopped, an internally geared hub might be a good choice for you. So have a great Q&A question here. If internally geared hubs are maintenance free, why do we have the external gears? So there is a trade-off, or two trade-offs primarily. The first is that internally geared hubs are slightly more expensive and slightly heavier, but the biggest downside is that you can't put as big of a gear range inside of an internally geared hub as you can for the same cost as putting all those gears on the outside. There's just too many small parts in a small area to get as large of a gear range as simply as you can with a, say, 7-speed chain and derailleur set. So cost, weight, and shifting range all kind of play into whether or not a bike comes with an internally geared hub or not. So you're going to find 3-speed internally geared hubs on kind of the less expensive end of bike prices. You'll find 7 to 14 speed internally geared hubs on more expensive bikes. And does a belt look very different from a chain? We'll get this one also because we're right here. So this is what your belt looks like. And then back up one. And this is what a chain looks like. So if you have a bike that has a rear derailleur, then it definitely has a chain on it. There's no, that I know of, system for shifting belts currently. They're always set up like this in a single speed, right? One gear in the front, one gear in the back, one pair of gears, a single speed configuration. They can't be shifted. So if you have any sort of derailleur, you definitely have a chain. Beyond that, if you have a single speed bike with a chain, you'll notice that the chain is about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch wide. It's a pretty narrow piece of material. The belt's going to be about 1/2 an inch wide. So if you have a single speed bike and there's a skinny 1/4 of an inch drive, then that's going to be a chain. Anything else wider is going to be a belt. Belts still aren't super common. So unless you specifically were looking for a very low maintenance commuter, you probably got a bike with a chain. Belts are great, but a little bit more expensive and just a little bit less common, although they're becoming more so. All right. So that's some bike anatomy there. So that's where the shifting happens, but how do you make it activate? So this is the top-down view of your kind of typical, this would be a mountain bike, but would it be applicable to any sort of standard flat bar bikes? So if you had a cruiser or a hybrid bicycle, your control setup might look like this. So on the left-hand side, we have the front shifter. On the right-hand side, we have the rear shifter. And so the front shifter is going to control your front derailleur. You may or may not have this, depending on whether or not you have a front derailleur. Any bike with gears will have a right-hand shifter that's going to drive either the rear derailleur or the internally geared hub. And this particular type has paddles for changing your shifts, right? The big paddle is going to make your ride easier in the back. And the little trigger here is going to make your ride harder. It's going to change your gears to a smaller cog. And as we can see here, right, front's going to control the front, left's going to control the front, sorry, and your right's going to control the rear. And so when you're manipulating your shifters, you want to make sure that you're kind of matching what gear you are in the front to what gear you are in the back. So one of the ways that is easiest to remember this is if you're in a low gear, your chain's going to be close to the left side of the bike, right? Left for low. As you shift into higher gears, right, this would be sort of a middle of the road gearing, right? Middle chain ring up front, middle gear on the back of your cassette, right? You're getting farther to the right side of the bike. And then, right, your very highest gear would be all the way to the right. And so an important thing to avoid is being in your very hardest gear in the front and your very hardest gear in the back. Right? This would be called cross-chaining. It puts a lot of stress into your chain and drivetrain and isn't great for all those components. So when you're starting out, you might be in a low gear like this. Then you're going to fine-tune your speed, your cadence with the right-hand shifter, adjusting your rear shifting. And then if you have it, you're going to jump up as you accelerate, you'll jump up into the middle chainring and then up to the high chainring. Again, your left hand's controlling the front, which is going to be big changes, and your right hand's controlling the rear, which is going to be small changes. If you're in easiest to easiest, it is not as bad as being in the hardest to hardest. And the reason why, as you can see here, is when you're in the hardest gear in the back, hardest gear in the front, easiest gear in the back, you're going to be stretching this derailleur out, right? Its job is to take up all the slack in the chain. And so if you're in this big combination, it's really trying to bring that derailleur and pull the chain out as wide as it can go. And that's not a position that the derailleur likes being in. And if your chain wasn't sized correctly, it can actually pull the derailleur off as this chain tries to make that loop smaller. So if you're in the reverse, where you're in the easiest gear in the front and the hardest gear in the back, right, this is going to be folded all the way back up. So you're going to have a lot of extra slack in the chain, but it's not going to be trying to force anything apart or together. So still not advisable because you're still going to be pushing the chain to go through these two bends, but it's not as catastrophically, catastrophically is an exaggeration. It's just not as bad for the system as it would be in this big configuration. All right. So going back to our previous slide here. So if your shifters are numbered, they're going to always be numbered from 1 being your lowest gear to 3 being your highest gear, or 5 or 7 or 10. So 1's going to be your lowest. So if you have a, for example, a 1 to 5 on the back, 1 would be your large gear, your low gear towards the left. Remember, left is low. And then the 5 is going to be your highest gear. Aha. And then one of our Brompton users also asked a question here, which is a good one. Does cross-chaining apply even if the rear gear is internal while the front is external, as in a Brompton folding bike? So if you have a bike that only has 1 ring up front and then 1 cog in the back, then it's fine. Any internally geared hub that doesn't have a cassette on it is not running through the derailleur, so you really don't have to worry about shifting which part of the range you're shifting into. Similarly, if you had a single chainring up front and a cassette, it's totally fine to be on one end of the range or the other, right? So if you had a single speed up front and 5 in the back, you could be in 1 or 5. If you don't have a front shifter, cross-chaining doesn't apply to you because you can't get into situations where you're all the way to one side or the other in the front. You just have one choice, so you're stuck. All right. So that's cross-chaining. So we'll recap here. So when you're riding along, remember your left-hand shifter is going to move the front derailleur and be your kind of course adjustment. So if you're riding along and you come to an uphill, you're going to want to move to an easier gear in the front and then fine tune with your rear derailleur to dial in your speed. And then always, right, when the chain moves in towards the bike, it's getting easier, left is low. And when it moves to the right, it's getting harder. So on your right-hand shifter, which will hit your rear derailleur or internally geared hub, as the chain moves towards the bike, it's getting easier, and away from the bike, it's getting harder. So right-hand shifter, it's more of your fine adjustments. So if you're riding along and you're trying to drop one gear, when I say you're dropping one gear to change your cadence or power you're putting into the bike, I mean you're moving down one gear. And by down, I mean lower, so to the left. You're moving down one gear on the back. If you moved down one gear in the front, you'd find it much, much easier or much, much harder all of a sudden. So wouldn't be quite as good for bumping up your cadence slightly. So one of the things that will help keep you kind of on track with regards to where your chain is just use one shifter at a time, right? If you are trying to shift up with your left-hand shifter and shift down with your right-hand shifter, it can be easy to lose track of where the chain is and end up cross-chained. So I would say move one shifter at a time, use one derailleur at a time, and I would start with the front and then dial it in with the back. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but is pretty important, to the point raised earlier about not shifting when you're stopped, you also don't want to shift when you're pedaling super hard on the bike, but the chain does have to be moving. So when you're shifting, a good way to get a smooth, easy shift is to lighten up on the pedals. So keep your cadence, but stop putting as much power into it. Lighten up a little bit as you're pushing the shifter. And as you're lightening up and pushing the shifter, it takes the load off the chain. The chain can hop up or down into the next gear, and then you can put load onto it once it's completed that shift. And you'll hear it kind of make a grinding or grabbing noise as it's making that shift. And once it quiets back down, that's how you know it's dropped onto the next gear and that you can start adding power again. If it's sitting back there and making a grindy, bad noise, don't start putting power onto it because it could slip or it could prevent that shift from completing at all. It might just stay stuck grinding up against the next gear. It's also a good sign that your shifting needs to be adjusted. All right. So we're going to pause here for a second and take any questions and answers about shifting you have. And the slides will be distributed after this session.
Robert, I have a question.
Yes.
I can't remember if this is answered on a later slide. Can you explain what dropping a chain is?
Yes.
And how to fix it?
Yeah, so our next setup is going to be, our next section is going to be maintenance, and we'll get to dropping a chain and what to do when that happens.
Thank you.
Deo has a question that we'll get to in the next section as well about adjusting your shifting. All right, here's a good one. If you run out of low gears on a steep hill, does that mean I don't have enough gears? It doesn't necessarily mean you have enough gears. There's some hills that, like the one earlier, that there's no gear that's going to let you keep a high enough cadence on that hill. And realistically, unless you're running out of gears all the time, most bikes have a fairly sufficient range. If you are finding in your riding that you're going up a bunch of hills and you keep running out of gears, it might be time to consider setting that bike up with some lower gearing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have enough gears or that the bike's wrong, just that there are some steep hills out there, and for the type of bike and your riding style, you just might not have all the gears all the time. For example, if you have a road bike, those tend to be more oriented towards higher speeds, and so they often don't have as low of a gear range as a mountain bike would, for example. So you would expect on a road bike, if you hit a steep hill, you're probably going to run out of gears because that bike is expecting that you're just going to power through that. If that's not something you want to do, then that's when you've run out of gears and might consider a different either style of bike or again, changing the gearing. And there's a certain amount of wiggle room on bikes to be able to get that gearing higher or lower without changing the entire style of bike. All right, let's move on. All right, so maintaining your shifting. So there are many fine videos out there on how to maintain different aspects of your shifting. So we're just going to do a pretty basic recap here of what it means to maintain your shifting. And we're going to be mostly looking at derailleur systems, right? So if you have a rear derailleur, this would apply to you. Like I mentioned earlier, internally geared hubs aren't going to need as much maintenance. And the maintenance that they do require is generally best provided at a bike shop, just because they tend to either need none or a fairly significant overhaul. So we won't be delving too deeply into that. But the first thing you want to do is maintain your chain. So your chain is a series of links with little rollers in between them, and every ounce of power you put into the cranks goes through the chain and ends up at the rear wheel. But your chain's also exposed to rain and dirt and all sorts of nasty stuff off the road, and that turns into basically a grinding abrasive slurry that will gradually wear down the internals on your chain and the teeth in your chain rings and cassettes. So to mitigate this, we try to keep our chains lubricated. And in our climate, and by our climate, I mean here in the Bay Area, and in particular, if you're in the South Bay, our climate tends to be very mild, Mediterranean. Our winters aren't that cold or that wet. Our summers are quite pleasant, except for the heat wave we've been having. So in general, you don't need a very thick lubricant. I would recommend if you go into a bike shop, they would call it dry lubricant or light lubricant or a summer lubricant. And all that means is that it's a lighter weight oil, and that is going to get down in between the rollers and plates, not cause too much friction, and be easy to wipe off. Winter, wet weather, thicker lubricants will hold on better during wet weather riding, but are going to be a little bit more difficult to apply and are generally not needed for our summer riding ever, and only needed really if you're riding like daily in the winter and are expecting a lot of water to be hitting your chain and washing that out. So as you can see in the photo, applying chain lube is pretty straightforward. This is the bottom run of the chain, and they're just applying a drop to each one of those little rollers. You can see there's a little bit of excess hanging off there. So what you want to do is apply lubricant along here, pedal backwards so that the chain feeds through, and you can apply chain lube to each link. And then while you're still pedaling backwards, use a clean, dry rag to wipe all the excess off. And I can't understate the importance of step number 2, wiping all the excess off, because any excess that's on the outside of the chain is just going to attract more dirt, right? The only place the oil is useful is when it's on the inside of the chain, keeping that chain lubricated. So anything on the outside you can take off. So do a good thorough job of cleaning that chain off. You're going to see on the rag or shop towel you're using a lot of black oily gunk, and that's all the material that's coming out of the chain that would have been sitting in there chewing it up. So that's step one, basic bike maintenance, keep your chain lubricated. How do you know when it needs lubrication? If you start hearing it squeaking, that's when it's time. If the chain starts squealing, then it's past time and you really need to do it. But when your chain starts getting just a little bit squeaky, that's a good point. You don't need to do this every ride. If you over lubricate your chain or don't wipe the excess off, right, you can build up a bunch of gunk on your derailleur pulleys and in your cassette, so you don't need to go crazy with it. Just once every couple of rides or whenever it's squeaky is a good range. So if you're riding daily, then I would say probably once every couple of weeks, depending on how dusty or wet your conditions are. If you're mountain biking daily, then you're going to want to do this more often. If you're road riding, commuting daily, then I would say probably every 2 weeks, depending on the length of your ride. But definitely, if you're riding daily, just listen for your chain making a little bit more noise than it should be, and that's a good flag that it needs attention. All right, that's chain maintenance. Those of you lucky enough to have belts don't need to do any of that. Just keep riding your bike and enjoying it, and the belt sort of takes care of itself. Bring it into a shop every once in a while for adjustment, and it'll be just great. All right, the other place where you can get into some easy maintenance is just keep an eye on your cables and housing. So all of your force going from your thumbs into the shifters gets transmitted along a cable pulled through the housing. So if you notice that there's wire strands sticking out of your shifter, or that your shifting's gotten muddy or soft and it's not working quite as well as it should be, take a look at your housing and make sure that it's complete. There's no cracks, it hasn't split. You shouldn't be able to see the wires like in this cross section. This would be brake housing. You may also have universal housing. So again, if you see wires or fraying or splitting in your housing, that's another easy sign to look for as to why your shifting may not be as good as it could be. All right, and we have two more questions on chains. So when is it time to replace a chain? That's an excellent question, and I wish I had a good slide in here for it. There are tools called chain checkers that you can place on top of the chain, and it sits in between the two pins in the chain, and it tells you whether or not that chain's worn out. Another way to do it is to use a ruler and then measure 12 lengths of chain, and that should be 12 inches. And if that pin is out by more than a 1/16 of an inch, it's been a while since I did the ruler method, since the chain checker is so much faster and they're pretty cheap. Yeah, if those pins have stretched apart, and we're talking about very small distances, which is why you're using a 12-inch measure, then it's time to replace your chain. If you can, I would highly recommend stopping by a bike shop or your favorite online retailer and buying a chain checker. They're pretty cheap. It's something you can check when you're oiling your chain, and they'll help you catch any chain wear before it gets too bad. Chains have a lifetime of about, give or take, 2,500 miles. So if you're riding a lot, that might be, inside of a year. If you're not riding a whole ton, that could be multiple years of riding for you. So that's one of the other tips we'll get to is that we recommend bringing your bike into a shop for a checkup, a tune-up annually, and they would also be checking your chain wear during that as well. If you're riding daily, if you're riding for longer rides on a daily basis in particular, then you might want to be checking it at home yourself. Do you need degreasers for chains and how to use them? So what I covered was the very basic form of chain maintenance. You can get much farther into maintaining your chain, up to and including taking it off, waxing it, etc. I would say you don't need a degreaser. It's not a mandatory piece of equipment. I find it adds a lot of complexity and cleanup for people who might be doing this fairly casually, and it's another thing to do. And so I would say, unless you're going for really long rides, riding every day, riding in really wet or muddy conditions, getting to that level of chain maintenance probably isn't going to be a huge payoff for the amount of work it is. That said, if you are competing on bikes or riding extensively, then using a chain cleaner with a degreaser in it to remove all the grime from the chain and then applying lubricant can extend the life of your chain somewhat, but it's not a mandatory part of this process, at least for basic maintenance. All right, so yeah, we'll get to chain falling off in the next slide. We're almost there, I promise you guys. All right, so this is a shot from the back of the bike looking forwards. And this goes to the question, if my shifting needs to be adjusted, but we're riding and can't get it right to the shop, tools and tips. All right, so there's a few adjustments on your shifters, sorry, on your derailleurs. You want, there's your aforementioned upcoming chain drop slide. All right, so you want, ideally, when you're in a gear, for the top pulley of your rear derailleur to be lined up with whichever gear you're in. If you are finding that your shifting is making a grinding noise in every gear, it might be that it has gone out of alignment horizontally and it needs a slight adjustment in terms of the tension on the cable and housing that we were showing you earlier. So unfortunately, it's not pictured here because it's just out of frame, but on your derailleur or up near your shifter, there's a little barrel adjuster. And you can screw that barrel adjuster out to make your derailleur move inwards. Likewise, you can screw the barrel adjuster inwards to make your derailleur move outwards. For most derailleurs, there's a couple of weird ones out there that don't work that way. But if you're finding that it's off in every gear, you need to make a little adjustment on your barrel adjuster. And you shouldn't be doing more than, half a turn, a turn. If you notice that your chain keeps trying to hop off, either to the inside or outside, or that it's making a grinding noise in the hardest or easiest gear, it may be that the limit screws that limit how far that derailleur can move are also out of adjustment or out of adjustment instead, and those just need to be adjusted. They sit on either side of the derailleur's travel and stop it from going too far one direction or the other. So you can adjust that with a screwdriver. Your high limit screw controls how far the derailleur can move towards the high gear. The low limit screw controls how far the derailleur can move towards the low gear. And again, these should be on the road pretty small adjustments. If you're finding that you're having to make a lot of turns on either the barrel adjuster or the limit screws, I'd recommend stopping and evaluating if there's something else going on. All these adjustments should be very small. Things that can cause major misalignments in your shifting. This is your derailleur hanger. It's what your derailleur hangs off of. And it's hard to see here, but this piece is made out of a separate chunk of aluminum from the frame. so that if it gets damaged, it can be replaced. And this is designed as a weak link. So if your derailleur gets bumped, this derailleur hanger can bend or snap. And if your derailleur hanger has been bent inwards or outwards, it's going to impact shifting. And you'll see that as some of the gears, either the top half or lower half, being harder or easier to shift in or out of. In extreme cases, you can break this derailleur hanger entirely. Let's say if you hit the bike on a rack, trying to pull it in or out, that sort of thing. It takes a fair amount of force, but does happen. So be aware of, if you're making big adjustments, there may be something wrong with your derailleur hanger. There may also be something wrong with your cables and housing. So again, look for any sort of damage on those pieces of housing running between your shifters and derailleurs. Look for that wear, damage. If you find that you can shift into easier gears, but not shift back into harder gears, then your cable might be binding up inside the housing, and you would need to replace the cable and housing. So that's the basics of your gear adjustment. All right. So if you have DI2 and the rear upshifts and sometimes doesn't catch on certain gears, then you upshift again and downshift to get to the gear you want. So for everyone in the audience, DI2 is electric shifting. So you're actually telling a servo to move the derailleur rather than using cable and housing. So this sounds like the rear derailleur might not be indexed correctly, right? It may not have been told exactly where those gears are. It also sounds like potentially a derailleur hanger misalignment, right? Because if you're good shifting in one direction but not the other, it can be that that derailleur hanger is out of alignment and is pulling the chain out of where it should be. I'd recommend bringing that to a shop, and they're going to be able to sit there and take a look and align it, because DI2 does operate on 10 and 11 speed bikes. The spacing between the cogs and the chain is very tight. It's a tight tolerance system, so it can be hard to spot issues without getting it up into a stand and knowing exactly where everything should be sitting. All right, so that's the basics of adjusting your gears. And again, we'll be linking out to videos that are more in depth on this topic that you can get down into the meat of it. But I really want to get to our next slide. On-road issues. So you've done this, your chain has come off, it's a terrible event. So here you can see the chain has dropped to the inside of the bike. It's fallen off of the left side of the low chain ring. And there's a few options here. If you're riding along and it just kind of fell off, sometimes you can shift up into the bigger ring, and that's going to force the chain back up onto the small ring. And then you'll want to check your limit screws to make sure that this derailleur is not sliding in too far and letting that chain fall off. If you end up in a situation where it looks like this one, and that chain's fallen down around the bottom bracket, and you can't get it to shift up, then don't keep pedaling on it. Pull over, stop, and what you're going to want to do is grab this lower run of the chain. Right? If you're working up on this side, you're fighting your wheel, you're fighting the front derailleur. Grab this lower side of the chain where it's hanging down. And what you're going to do is you're going to grab about here and gently just put that chain back onto that lower chain ring and pedal it backwards and roll that chain back on. This can be tricky depending on how far the chain's gotten jammed down in there. That's a pretty bike specific issue. But for 9 times out of 10, if you're sitting here, just pulling that chain on and then working it back around is going to work fine. And because the cassette can freewheel backwards and the derailleur is spring loaded this way, you're not going to be fighting the whole system while you're trying to put it back on. So start here, go backwards. If you've fallen off the back, then it very much depends on whether you've fallen into the wheel or fallen in between the frame. Generally, either way, you're going to end up needing to take the bike to a shop to make sure you haven't damaged the frame or the wheel. Falling off into the wheel on the back can cause damage to your spokes. Falling off towards the frame can damage the dropout. And so when I see this on the road, generally if you've fallen off to the outside, to the harder gears, you're going to be jammed in between that small gear and the rear wheel and have to drop the rear wheel out of the bike, put the chain back onto the cog it was supposed to be on, and then insert it back in. If you've fallen off to the inside, then sometimes you can work that out just by working the chain backwards and lifting it up. Again, if you're working the chain forwards, you're going to have to be rolling the bike forwards, which is difficult. If it's really jammed in there, it might be kind of a ride-ending event where you have to either stop and take the wheel off, take the cassette off and get that chain out of there, or because most of us don't carry cassette tools and chain whips on casual rides, you might have to take it to a shop where they can do that operation and pull it out for you. So if you've dropped a chain, try putting it back on to the gear that it should be. If you have to drop the rear wheel out, you can make your whole life easier by shifting the rear derailleur all the way down to the hardest gear, or all the way up to the hardest gear rather, and then putting the chain on there. Right? It's always easier to put the chain on in the smallest cog because it's not fighting the tension in the derailleur. So if you've put it back on and you're in the wrong gear, it's okay. Just lift the rear of the bike up a little bit and pedal forwards, right? Lifting the rear of the bike up lets the rear wheel spin, and pedaling forwards pushes the chain through in the direction it should be going, and that'll get the chain to shift back up to the correct gear. Again, if your chain's falling off regularly, it's very likely your limits are out of adjustment on your rear derailleur or front derailleur, whichever derailleur is dropping the chain, and you should get that adjusted. If you find it's happening quite a bit and your derailleurs are in adjustment, which can happen for a variety of reasons, it is possible for the front, which is where this usually happens, to get a chain catcher, which physically prevents the chain from falling off to the inside. So that's also an option. All right, so I think that covers dropping your chain. We'll go on to our little recap. Keep in mind, keep your chain lubricated. Check the condition of your cables and housing. In general, derailleurs don't go out of adjustment. Cables and housing get compressed or rusty or kinked or all of the above, and that impacts your shifting. So check these before you start messing with your shifters or derailleurs. Adjustments, keep these minor. If you're having to do a whole bunch of alterations, then it's probably because there's something else going on in the system, either your cables or housing. I mentioned your derailleur hanger could be bent or broken. So try to avoid using those limit screws and barrel adjusters as a patch to fix a bigger problem. On-road repairs, always make sure that you're trying to make sure that you know what the issue was before you ride off. So if you had your chain fall off, put it back on, and then run through the gears and make sure that it's shifting correctly and that your derailleur is not bent out of position, or there's some other problem that you didn't notice before you started on your ride that's going to just keep reoccurring. You don't want to keep having to stop and put your chain back on. Take the time, fix it if you can. All right, so that's our maintenance recap and the end of our formal presentation. So we're open for Q&A now. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but if you have questions, please let us know.
I think we can wrap it all up. Thank you, Robert. This was really educational. I learned something new every time. We will be sending out a link to the recording. We'll be sending out the Be Well Barry confirmation form that you'll need to resubmit to Be Well to get credit. And we'll also be sending out a list of resources that include videos on how to make simple repairs and more complicated repairs. And then we'll also send out all the Q&As that came inbound, and we'll answer them. So we look forward to hosting you again. Our next webinar is next Wednesday, How to Fix a Flat, something everyone should know how to do, and Robert's going to join us for that. So thanks, everyone. Stay healthy, stay cool, and be safe.